The wind carried a bitter edge as it swept across Red Dust, a frontier town that had once dreamed of prosperity but now clung to life like a dying mule to its last breath. The sun sagged low behind the jagged hills, staining the sky with copper and crimson, and every shuttered window rattled as though the buildings themselves trembled at the memory of better days. Dust drifted through the main street like wandering spirits, slipping beneath saloon doors and into the boots of weary travelers. It was a town carved by wind, worn by time, and held together only by routine and the stubbornness of those too tired to leave. Inside the Red Dust saloon, the stale scent of cigar smoke and spilled whiskey hung thick enough to chew. Men spoke in low, tired voices, their laughter muted by the weight of long days and longer regrets. The piano sat untouched, its keys gathering more dust than melodies. Only the creak of chairs and the clink of glasses broke the silence that always lived just beneath the noise. At the bar, an old man sat quietly, hands wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. His coat was threadbare, the color long stolen by sun and time. His hat sat low, casting a sliver of shadow across a face carved by deep valleys of age. He was the kind of man no one noticed unless they looked too closely, and most folks didn't dare. Those who did, even by accident, often turned away without knowing why, unsettled by something they couldn't name lingering behind his stillness. His eyes, when they lifted at all, carried storms that had never fully passed and graves that no amount of years could bury. Beside him sat his son, a lanky drifter with calloused hands and worn-out boots, quietly minding his own drink. Most folks liked the boy well enough. He never drank more than he could handle and never spoke louder than he meant to. But tonight, fate had a cruel way of placing the wrong men in the same room. A young gunslinger strutted into the saloon, his spurs jingling like tiny bells announcing trouble. He was all swagger and shine, wearing a coat too new and a grin too sharp. His eyes swept the room, searching for someone to impress, someone to belittle, someone to fear him. His gaze landed on the old man at the bar, and something in his smirk curled meaner. "Well now," he drawled loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Ain't this a sight? Look at this wrinkled scarecrow." Someone rustled him straight out of the grave. A couple of men chuckled, nervous, uneasy. The bartender's shoulders tightened, and the drifter's jaw clenched. But the old man did not move, not even to sip his coffee. He merely breathed in, breathed out, as if mocking words were nothing more than dust settling on his coat. The gunslinger swaggered closer, boots thudding on the wooden floor, spurs dragging like metal claws. "Hey, old-timer," he continued, tapping the bar near the man's elbow. "You even awake? Or are you just sitting here waiting for someone to finish you off proper?" The drifter rose slowly, palms open, voice gentle as worn leather. "Leave him be," he said. "He ain't both airing you." The gunslinger snapped his attention to the younger men, eyes narrowing with amusement. "And who are you supposed to be?" "His keeper." "His son," the drifter replied. The gunslinger blinked, then burst into laughter. "His son? Lord Almighty, did he father you when he was already cuffing dirt? Boy, he looks like a stiff wind might take him clean off this earth." More laughter sputtered through the saloon, but it wasn't warm. It carried the thin tremble of men laughing to avoid trouble. Still, the old man said nothing. The gunslinger leaned so close his breath fogged the old man's coffee. "What's wrong? Got your tongue? You too old to stand up for yourself." A chair scraped loudly in the corner. Several men looked away, not wanting to watch what might follow. The bartender moved one bottle behind the counter, as though clearing space for violence. The old man lifted his eyes for the first time. They weren't weak. They weren't tired. They were cold. Too cold. Cold enough to freeze a man's heartbeat mid-chest. The gunslinger faltered, but only for a moment. Pride is a dangerous thing in a young man armed with steel and stupidity. He puffed out his chest again, forcing a grin back onto his lips. "Ah, so you can look up. That's good. Means you'll know who's beating you when the time comes." No one in the room breathed. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the saloon walls, rattling the lanterns like a warning from the desert itself. A traveler near the door swallowed hard, whispering under his breath, "Fool don't know what he's poking at." The drifter stepped forward, voice quiet but firm. "You got your laugh. Let it be." But the gunslinger wasn't done. He wanted a show. He wanted fear. And he chose the one man in the room who offered none. "I said," he growled, slamming his hand on the bar. "Stand up, old man." The old man didn't rise, didn't flinch, didn't blink. His calm wrapped around the room like a tightening noose. Even the lamp seemed to dim under the weight of it. Something shifted in the silence. A memory. A rumor. A breath of truth. A few men in the saloon exchanged glances, small flickers of recognition crossing their faces. They had heard stories. Once. A name whispered in old trails. A ghost spoken of around dying campfires. But none dared speak it aloud. The gunslinger leaned closer. "I'm calling you out. You hear me?" Finally, the old man set down his cup. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel sealing a fate. He rose to his full height, not tall, not imposing, yet somehow filling the room more than any man there. Age bent his bones, but his presence straightened the air. His voice was quiet. Too quiet. A whisper wrapped in steel. "I hear you." A chill rippled through the saloon. The gunslinger's grin wavered, but he smothered it quickly, stepping back to give himself room. "You got a smart mouth for someone who looks halfway to the grave already," he sneered. But the old man wasn't listening. He was studying the gunslinger the way a rancher studies a broken fence, calculating, patient, deciding whether fixing it was worth the trouble. The drifter touched his father's arm gently. "Pa, let's just go. Let's just walk out." The old man didn't look at him, but his voice softened by a margin. "Go on outside, son. I'll be along shortly." The drifter hesitated, torn between fear and faith. Fear of the gunslinger, faith in the father he'd never quite understood. He obeyed, stepping toward the door with slow, reluctant strides. Outside, the wind shifted, kicking up dust. A tumbleweed skittered past like a warning that no one would heed. The gunslinger spat on the floor. "Your boy's got more spine than you. Least he can stand up. All you got left is bones and memories." The old man stepped forward, and the floorboards groaned under his weight, not from the strain of age, but from something far heavier that clung to him. Something ancient. Something lethal. "You've said enough," he murmured. The gunslinger scoffed. "I ain't even started." People backed away from him as if he carried plague. The bartender reached for the lantern wick, dimming the room as though darkness might soften the blow of what was coming. Outside, the drifter stopped halfway down the steps, heart pounding, sensing something terrible unfolding behind him. The wind stilled. Even the horses tied to the post stopped shifting. Inside, the gunslinger tapped the butt of his pistol. "So tell me, old man, you really think you can stand against me?" The old man's eyes lifted once more, and in them burned a truth the gunslinger was too blind to read. A truth carved from blood, fire, and a past drenched in the dust of fallen men. A truth the town had prayed would never wake again. "I don't stand against boys," the old man whispered. "I stand against killers." The gunslinger blinked, confused, just long enough for fear to bloom. "You don't know who I am," the old man continued, voice steady as an executioner's hand. "But you will." Morning crept over red dust like a reluctant confession. The desert light broke slow, pale and cold, spilling across rooftops warped by heat and memory. The town stirred uneasily after the night's tension, whispers rising with the dust, rumors carried from lip to lip like dying embers clinging to breath. No one spoke loud enough to be caught repeating what they thought they knew, but everyone had the same look when the old man passed, a look of sudden recollection, a fear resurfaced from years they had tried to forget. He walked the same way he had last night, steady, deliberate, as if every step meant something. The drifter followed him at a distance, uncertain whether to speak or stay silent. He wanted answers but knew his father was a man who had buried words the same way others buried bones, deep, where the wind could not dig them up. The saloon owner swept his porch and muttered to no one, "I seen those eyes before." Not his name, but them eyes. Another answered from the shadows, "If it's who I think, God help us all." The air in town grew thick with anticipation. The gunslinger had ridden out at dawn, his pride bruised, his men soon to follow. They were the kind that didn't forgive insult, especially not one that made their leader look small. Word came from the telegraph station that a gang was riding hard, men with black scarves and blacker tempers, heading straight for red dust. Every door shuttered. Every mother called her children home. Even the sheriff stayed inside, pretending to clean his rifle while his hands shook too much to finish. By noon, the sky had turned white-hot, and heat shimmered off the road like ghosts in motion. The old man stood at the edge of town, looking east. The drifter joined him, uncertain. "Pa," he said quietly, "if they're coming for trouble, we can leave. Head north, crossed the river by nightfall. The old man didn't turn. A man can run from many things, he said softly, but not from what he's done. The drifter frowned. What did you do, Pa? The wind answered before he did, hollow, distant, carrying the faint jingle of spurs from far away. The old man's jaw tightened, and something behind his eyes shifted, a ghost of a memory, raw and sharp as the edge of a blade. I buried men, he said vinily. Too many. Some deserved it. Some didn't. But each one took a piece I never got back. The drifter stared, unsure if the words were confession or warning. You mean, in the war? The old man shook his head slowly. Before that. Long before that. Down the road, the horizon shimmered with movement, figures, faint at first, then clearer with each heartbeat. 10 riders, black coats flapping like wings of crows, dust pluming behind them. The gunslinger was at the front, his hat low, his anger burning bright enough to melt reason. The townsfolk saw the riders and fled indoors. The church bell didn't ring. It wouldn't have mattered. The old man looked toward the abandoned barn outside town. He moved there without hurry, but purpose followed him like a shadow. Inside, the air smelled of rust and straw. A broken lantern leaned against the wall beside a wooden chest that hadn't been opened in decades. He knelt, his hands trembling, not with age, but with memory. The chest creaked when he lifted the lid. Inside lay relics of another life, a worn duster coated in sand, a revolver wrapped in oilcloth, a length of rope stained by storms and time. His fingers brushed the metal of the gun, feeling the cold familiarity of it, like touching the pulse of an old sin. He unwrapped it carefully, eyes glinting in the half-light. The revolver was engraved along the barrel, a faint marking near the sight, R.D. The initials no one dared speak aloud anymore. The initials that once made bounty hunters cross the street rather than meet his gaze. Red Daniels. A name the West had buried. He loaded the chamber slowly, each bullet sliding in with a soft, fateful click. The sound echoed through the barn like a sermon meant only for the dead. Outside, the drifter waited, confusion twisting his gut. Pa, what are you doing in there? The door opened, and the old man stepped out dressed not as a drifter, but as something older, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. The coat hung from his shoulders like the weight of all the men who'd fallen before him. The revolver rested on his hip, where it once lived so comfortably that his hand seemed made for it. The drifter's voice cracked. You're him. You're the one they tell stories about. The old man's eyes met his. Stories die easy. Truth don't. The first gunshot cracked the silence. A warning from the gang announcing their arrival. The drifter flinched, but his father didn't blink. He stepped into the middle of the road, the same road that ran like a scar through red dust. The gang rode in hard, hooves thundering, eyes sharp with cruelty. The gunslinger's smile was back, uglier now, stripped of charm and fattened by vengeance. Well, I'll be damned, he called out, reining in his horse. The old ghost himself. Didn't think I'd get the honor. You don't deserve the word, the old man said, his voice low, steady as a storm before it breaks. The gunslinger laughed. You really think one old man's gonna stop 10 of us? I don't stop men, the father said quietly. I outlast them. The drifter wanted to move, to pull him back, but something in his father's stillness rooted him to the ground. There was no fear in that stance, only inevitability. Like a mountain deciding it was time to fall. The gang dismounted, spreading out, hands near their guns. The town watched through cracks in their shutters. The air tasted of iron and heat. Flies circled the water trough, the only sound in the silence before death. Then, without a word, the old man turned his back on them and began walking east, toward the canyons. Confusion rippled through the gang. What's he doing? One muttered. Follow him, the gunslinger ordered. If he wants to die on his feet, let's oblige him. The riders followed at a distance, boots and spurs ringing like chains in the still air. The drifter started after them, but his father's voice cut through the wind. Stay back, son. He froze. There was something final in the tone, something that said goodbye without saying the word. The desert opened wide beyond the last fence post, the land stretching into waves of sandstone and silence. The sun sank lower, bleeding into the horizon, and shadows grew long enough to swallow whole men. The old man's figure was small against that vastness, but he walked like he owned it, like he'd fought it once and left his name carved in its bones. The gang followed, 10 against 1, their laughter echoing between the red cliffs. One spat on the ground. Old fool's lost his mind. Another snorted. Maybe he's got a hideout. They didn't see the way his footsteps slowed as he neared a narrow trail cutting between two cliffs. The air grew cooler there, heavier, filled with something unseen. The rocks seemed to lean in closer, listening. He stopped at the entrance of the trail, where the dirt turned dark with shadow. The canyon yawned before him, deep and silent, holding memories too heavy to fade. This place had once run red under his hands. He promised never to come back, never to wake the ghosts buried beneath its stones. But promises mean little to the dead. Behind him, the gang dismounted, spreading in a crescent. The gunslinger's grin widened. This where it ends, old man. The old father looked into the canyon's mouth and whispered something no one could hear. The wind caught it, carried it away. He turned, the sun catching his eyes, and for a moment, the years peeled back. The lines of age dissolved, replaced by the sharp focus of a man who once survived every duel he ever faced. The gunslinger hesitated, not out of mercy, but because something in those eyes told him he'd just walked into the wrong story. The old man took one step backward into the canyon's shadow. The ground trembled slightly, like the earth itself remembering. The canyon was silent, save for the faint rustle of sand sliding off the stones where the old man had disappeared. The gang waited at the entrance, guns drawn, breath shallow. Even their horses pawed nervously at the ground, sensing something wrong. The air was heavy, unmoving, like the land itself was holding its breath. The gunslinger spat into the dust. "He's one man," he said, voice echoing against the rock. "You're telling me you're scared of a pile of bones?" No one answered. The canyon swallowed sound too easily. He gestured. "Two of you, go in first." Two riders stepped forward, glancing at each other before moving into the narrow cut between the cliffs. Their boots crunched on loose stone, rifles raised. The path twisted deeper, the walls closing in, painted red by centuries of wind. Every turn looked the same. Every shadow looked alive. They saw no movement, only emptiness. Then came a soft metallic click. A gunshot cracked through the canyon. One man dropped instantly, the other froze, eyes wide. From somewhere unseen, the old man's voice rolled low and calm. "You should have stayed in the light." The second outlaw fired blindly toward the echo, the shot ricocheting off stone. A moment later, the sound of sliding gravel rushed from above, then silence. The canyon gave no hint of where the bullet had come from. Only when the others stepped closer did they see it. A thin tripwire stretched across the rocks, leading to a loaded rifle wedged in place. The old man hadn't needed to aim. He'd already set the canyon to do the killing for him. "Traps," one of the men whispered. "He's got the place rigged." The gunslinger sneered. "So he hides behind tricks now. Coward's way." But the tremor in his hand said otherwise. They moved forward carefully, spread thin. Every few yards, another sound teased them. A pebble falling, the whisper of fabric, the echo of a boot scraping stone. Yet they never saw him. The canyon played with their hearing, turning every noise into a ghost. A shadow flickered near the ridge, and one man fired. The gunshot boomed and bounced down the walls, but there was no cry, no body. When he turned, the old man was already behind him. The knife flashed once, swift and sure. The outlaw crumpled without a word. The gang fired wildly, bullets slamming into stone, sparks lighting the dark like dying fireflies. Dust filled the air, choking their lungs. The gunslinger shouted orders, but his voice cracked between the echoes. When the dust settled, another man was gone. "He's picking us off," one hissed. "Like a wolf in the dark." The gunslinger's face glistened with sweat. He wiped it with the back of his hand, smearing dirt across his cheek. "Spread out," he growled. "Flush him out." They fanned wider along the canyon, stepping over the bodies of their own. The old man moved like smoke between shadows, never seen long enough to be aimed at, never heard until it was too late. He'd learned long ago that a bullet was only half a weapon. The rest was patience. By the time they reached the halfway bend, 5 men were gone. The ones who remained gripped their guns tighter, eyes darting like trapped animals. At the center of the canyon, beneath a narrow outcrop, the old man waited. His breathing was steady. His mind, still as stone. Every sound around him told a story, the scrape of metal on rock, the shuffle of boots over grit. He could feel the weight of each man, the rhythm of fear quickening their steps. He hadn't wanted this. God knew he'd buried enough. But sometimes, Justice needed to be reminded what it looked like. One outlaw stumbled near a cluster of rocks. Beneath his boot, a thin fuse sparked to life. He froze just long enough to see it flare. The explosion tore through the narrow pass, hurling dust and debris into the sky. The blast echoed miles down the valley, scattering birds into the fading sun. When the smoke cleared, nothing moved. The gunslinger's voice broke the stillness, raw and furious. "Enough of this, old man. Come out and face me." The canyon gave no answer. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. The old man stepped from behind a ridge, smoke curling around him, coat torn at the sleeve. His revolver hung loose at his side, still warm from the fight. His face was calm, almost sorrowful. "I'm done fassin', boys," he said quietly. "You want a man's fight, son? Step forward." The gunslinger's hand trembled over his holster. "You're not human," he whispered. "You're deaf, Wakandot." The old man tilted his head. "Death's just a name men give to what they don't understand." The gunslinger drew. The old man moved first. 2 shots rang out. One tore through air. The other found its mark. The gunslinger staggered back, his shoulder bursting red. His gun fell, clattering against the stone. He dropped to his knees, gasping, staring up as the old man approached, steps echoing like a judge's verdict. The old man stood over him, revolver still raised, eyes hard as desert glass. "You brought 10 men," he said softly. "Now you stand alone. That's what pride does." The gunslinger's breath came in ragged gasps. Why didn't you kill me?" The old man looked toward the canyon's mouth, where sunlight bled into the dust. "Because my son's still watching, Dot." A flicker of confusion crossed the gunslinger's eyes. The old man holstered his weapon and turned slightly, voice heavy with something older than anger. "He needs to see the cost of a gun. He needs to know what justice really takes." He walked a few steps away, shoulders sagging under the weight of his own mercy. The gunslinger watched him go, hatred wrestling with the cold edge of fear. Blood soaked his sleeve, the pain dull compared to the shame burning through his chest. The old man paused near a weather post driven into the canyon floor, a relic from the days when miners once tied their mules there. He reached out, touching it gently, as if greeting an old friend. Beneath the sand, half buried, were bones, the remains of the men who tested him decades ago, when the canyon earned its name. The gunslinger tried to stand but stumbled. "You," he coughed, "you think this makes you a hero?" The old man didn't turn. "No," he said. "It just keeps you from being another ghost." He looked toward the fading horizon, where he knew his son waited. The boy would see the smoke, hear the echoes. He'd learned that violence never ends, it only waits. And maybe, by living through this, he'd choose a different path. Behind him, the gunslinger knelt in the dirt, clutching his wound, trembling, not from pain, but from the realization that he had faced something beyond men, beyond courage or cruelty. A thing the West itself had built and buried and feared to speak of. The wind rose, carrying the smell of gunpowder and iron. The canyon grew quiet again, as though satisfied that another chapter had been written in blood. The old man stood there a long time, head tipped low, eyes closed, listening to the desert breathe. When he finally walked away, he left no footprints, only silence, and a single truth whispering through the rocks. The deadliest man alive had shown his teeth, not to kill, but to remind the living why they should never wake what the desert had already buried. The sun was low when the gunfire died, painting the canyon walls in bleeding gold. Dust hung thick in the air, curling through the silence like the last breath of something old. The old man stood alone among the fallen, his shadow long and thin against the rock, the revolver heavy in his hand. Each echo faded slower than the last, as if the desert itself refused to let go of the sound. Behind him, the wind stirred the smell of gunpowder and grief, mingling them into one familiar scent he'd hoped never to know again. He looked at the gunslinger still kneeling in the dirt, clutching his wounded shoulder, eyes wide with the trembling horror of survival. There was defiance in his face, but it was the kind that comes from fear, not courage. The old man studied him, the lines of his expression unreadable, part judgment, part exhaustion. For a long while, he said nothing. Then he walked closer, boots grinding the gravel, and stopped just out of reach. "You wanted to see what made legends bleed," he said softly. "Now you have." The gunslinger's throat worked as he tried to speak. "Why didn't you finish it?" he rasped. "You killed the others. Why spare me?" The old man holstered his weapon with the slow care of a man tired of drawing it. "Because death's too easy," he murmured. "A bullet's a mercy. But living with what you saw, that's a sentence." He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You'll ride from this place and tell the world what you found in these canyons. Tell him you laughed at an old man and buried 9 friends for it." He leaned down, voice low enough to crawl into the young man's bones. "And remember this, son. Never measure a man by the years on his bones, but by the graves he's dug." The words landed heavier than the dust around them. The gunslinger's lips parted, but nothing came out. The old man turned and walked away, his steps slow but sure, leaving behind the weight of 10 dead men and 1 living ghost. The canyon swallowed him whole, shadows closing over him as the wind began to sing again. Soft, mournful, almost reverent. By nightfall, the gunslinger crawled back toward the open desert, bleeding and broken, his pride buried under the sand. When he reached red dust, he barely recognized it. The town was silent, the streets empty save for a few faces watching from behind shutters. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. He just rode on, the memory of the old man's eyes carved into his mind like a brand. By morning, the story had already begun to spread. The townsfolk told it in whispers at the saloon, over breakfast fires, and in the quiet moments before dawn. They said the drifter's father walked into a canyon alone and came back without a scratch, leaving 10 graves in his wake. They said the wind carried his name again, Red Daniels, the men who once brought justice to the frontier when law still slept. Some swore he'd sold his soul to the desert itself. Others said God had given him one last job before calling him home. But no matter how the tale was told, every version ended the same. The old man walked away from the killing grounds, and no one ever saw him again. The drifter waited for him until the second sunset. He sat on the edge of town, the horizon stretching endless and empty, his heart heavy with questions that had no place left to go. He thought of all the years his father had spent in silence, how he never raised his voice, never bragged, never shared the scars that marked his soul. And now he understood why. The quiet wasn't weakness, it was penance. It was the weight of ghosts he refused to let his son inherit. When he finally rose, he found the revolver holster his father had left behind, empty, old, and cracked with age. Inside, tucked in the leather lining, was a folded scrap of paper. The writing was rough, written by a hand that trembled from too many battles, but it was clear enough to read. "Son, there are 2 kinds of men in this world, the ones who chase blood, and the ones who carry it. I've been both. Don't follow me. Build something I can't. Live quiet. Live clean. Your pa." The drifter's hand shook as he held the note. The sun dipped lower, and for the first time, he realized that his father hadn't been running from his past. He'd been guarding everyone else from it. Every silence, every hesitation, every look that seemed lost in memory was the sound of a man trying to forget the sound of death. The town's sheriff approached as the last light faded. "Your pa," he said, voice low, "wasn't a man easy to figure. But what he did out there, it'll keep this place safe for a long time." He adjusted his hat, eyes down. Some men die making history. Some live long enough to make legends. Your pa did both. The drifter didn't answer. He just looked toward the east, where the desert met the dawn. In the distance, faint but certain, he saw a lone rider moving along the ridge. The light caught on his coat for a moment, dusty, worn, unmistakable. The old man didn't turn back. He just kept riding into the glow of the morning sun until the light swallowed him whole. The drifter felt something break and mend at the same time. He smiled faintly through the ache in his chest, the tears he didn't bother to hide. "Ride easy, Pa," he whispered. "You've earned your rest." As the years passed, red dust grew quieter still. The mine shut down. The saloon changed owners. But every so often, when the wind rolled through the canyon at dusk, the old-timers would pause their drinks and listen. Some swore they heard hoofbeats echoing far off in the stone corridors. Others claimed to see a shadow against the sunrise, tall and lean, a man still walking the edge between legend and ghost. The drifter grew older, took to ranching, married, and raised his own boy. He never carried a gun. When folks asked why, he'd just smile and say, "I've seen what guns turn men into." And on quiet nights, when the fire burned low, he'd tell his son about the men who once ended a war with silence and mercy instead of rage. The boy would listen wide-eyed, the way children listen to stories too big to believe, and when he'd ask if his grandfather was real, the drifter would simply say, real enough that the desert remembers. In time, the story of Red Daniels drifted beyond red dust, carried by travelers and traders until it became a piece of Western scripture. They called him the Quiet Reaper, the Desert Judge, the men who never missed. Each telling grew a little wilder, a little grander, but the heart of it stayed the same. He was the man who spared one fool so the rest would learn. No grave was ever found for him. No one ever claimed his hat, his boots, or his name. But somewhere beyond the mesas, where dawn bleeds pure and red, riders still whisper that an old man watches the horizon, waiting, not for vengeance, but for peace. They say the desert keeps his secret, that every canyon still carries his echo. And if you ride far enough, you might feel it, the weight of his gaze, the hush of his footsteps, the quiet reminder that justice doesn't shout. It endures. The wind rose again, gentle but sure, sweeping through red dust like a sigh. The town exhaled, the story settled, and the legend of the drifter's father folded itself into the fabric of the frontier. One more page in the book of the West, where heroes grow old, ghosts ride eternal, and the sun never stops rising on the men who've earned their silence.